ready.
Good luck, guys.
Congratulations.
Good job on making it smart.
Yes.
Is anyone not ready? Resolved, the United States ought not provide military aid to authoritarian regimes. The history of American military aid is one filled with profiting off of human rights abuses and building close relationships with autocratic leaders. We must make a change. For this reason, I am proud to defend the AF. First, some definitions. Military aid is aid which is used to assist a country or its people in its defense efforts, or to assist a poor country in maintaining control over its own territory. I'll be talking about troops, training, and weapons primarily today. Authoritarian is favoring or enforcing strict obedience to authority at the expense of personal freedom from Oxford. My value today in today's debate is morality, upheld by a value criterion of deontological reasoning. Deontology holds that some choices cannot be justified by their effects, that no matter how morally good their consequences, some choices are morally forbidden. This is meant to access the internal moral sense we all feel. No matter the consequences, we have internal instincts that tell us that murder is bad and that we shouldn't do it. That is essentially what deontology is referring to when it talks about morality and deontological sense. We have instincts that tell us that some choices are wrong no matter their effects. The right is said to have priority over the good. If an act is not in accord with the right, it may not be undertaken no matter the good it may produce. Contention 1. Giving military aid to authoritarian regimes is inherently unjust. To support, protect, and endorse regimes that commit horrible crimes against humanity in any way is against the right. For one example of a human rights violation, look to Saudi Arabia's involvement in the Yemen civil war. From Qana 18, the Saudis have launched 18,000 airstrikes on Yemen, attacking hospitals, schools, water treatment plants, and farms. The Saudis also imposed a blockade on food, fuel, and medicine in a deliberate effort to starve the civilian population into submission. The nation could experience the world's worst famine in 100 years, with 12 million to 13 million innocent civilians dying from lack of food imposed by the Saudis. The United States gives Saudi Arabia $114 billion of military aid, directly funding and endorsing its involvement in the Yemen civil war. Alternatively, we can look at women's rights. In Egypt, women constantly face invasive, dehumanizing treatment at the hands of the state. When female detainees were arrested for staging a small rally on International Women's Day, they were forced to have their hymens inspected by a uniformed military doctor. Now President Sisi claimed the measure was necessary to safeguard the honor of military officers and deflect potential rape accusations, apparently reasoning that non-virgins could not be raped. Unfortunately, this is not an extreme example for Egypt, nor many authoritarian regimes. Yet the United States plans to give Egypt $1.3 billion in military aid in 2019. We can also look at LGBTQ+ rights. On the 1st of March 2017, 2 transgender Pakistanis were tortured to death in Saudi Arabia after being packed in sacks and thrashed with sticks. Saudi Arabia's transgender community has long been persecuted by the state. In 2016, Saudi authorities instructed travel agents in Pakistan not to grant visas to transgender Muslims who were planning to make the Hajj or Umrah pilgrimage. The United States is currently supporting the systematic oppression of the LGBTQ+ community overseas. Among the 8 nations where homosexuality is punishable by the death penalty, we provide military aid to 7 out of them, the exception being Iran. It's clear to see that it's morally wrong to engage with regimes that act in such ways. When we aid these regimes and endorse their actions, we are acting inherently immorally. Via deontology, the right holds priority over the good, but the AF should also win on the good. This leads to my second contention, consequentialist outcomes. Subpoint A, military aid strengthens authoritarian tendencies. When looking at the outcomes of military aid, democratic intervention does not actually solve for the radical and dangerous actions taken by authoritarian regimes. In fact, it helps to fund them. Commander Arthur Gibb III of the Navy agrees in his PhD dissertation, writing, U.S. military aid actually encourages human rights abuses by recipient regimes. Recipients of military aid get worse rather than better after receiving American equipment and training, because military aid is simply an ineffective tool for influencing domestic policy. Policymakers are not inclined to use whatever leverage military aid might convey, and the consistent negative effect across times demonstrates that human rights concerns are superseded. If human rights concerns are not important enough for us to deny aid in the first place, they will receive no more than token attention from policymakers when considering continued provision of aid. Subpoint B, military aid promotes instability. Giving autocratic nations the ability to inflict further harm on their people doesn't create more stable countries. It creates angry hungrier populations with more to gain through revolution or civil war. Authoritarian regimes are inherently violent, and the strong correlation between U.S. foreign aid and instability is supported in a study from the Naval Postgraduate School, which found that our military aid spending had a tendency to increase internal conflict within nations. For example, recent reporting by CNN revealed that weapons sold to the Saudi-led coalition had transferred American-made weapons to al-Qaeda, using American weapons as a form of currency to buy the loyalties of terrorist organizations. Furthermore, many of those weapons provided to Saudi Arabia end up in the hands of Iranian fighters, exposing some of America's sensitive military technology to Tehran. Essentially, I see this debate on two fronts. We have for long, the United States has tried to use the ends to justify the means. The idea of consequentialism, right? The ends justify the means. The problem is, in foreign policy, and especially when it comes to military aid, we do not know what the ends are. If we look at the long historical precedent of how effective our military aid has been, we have not been able to achieve any of our policy objectives that we think we are when we are providing military aid to these authoritarian regimes. We can look at our history of instability within the Middle East. We have looked at the history of a lack of democratization despite millions of billions of dollars being poured into that region. Because we are so unsure about what those ends will be, we must therefore look at the means. The ends do not justify the means when the means are as inherently immoral as providing military aid to these regimes. I prioritize deontology, and I uphold this using morality. For these reasons, I am proud to stand on the app. Thank you.
So you believe that authoritarian regimes are inherently bad and suppress human rights?
I do. In every authoritarian regime, we see at the worst the examples I provide, or at the very
okay. So do you agree? So if a country is not respecting its human rights, we should stop supporting this country?
I believe so. Yes.
So would you also stop sending support to democracies that don't respect human rights?
So I think that authoritarian regimes are inherently going to disrespect human rights. Also, in this debate, I don't get to decide on democracies, right? So like, I don't think we should give nations military aid if they mistreat their people in any way. I don't get to decide in this round about democracies. I only get to decide about authoritarian regimes.
So you would generally say we shouldn't support countries that suppress human rights?
I agree with that, yes.
Furthermore, you talk about how would you agree that authoritarian regimes need to have a strong need for weapons to stay in power?
I do. I think the United States uniquely provides for this need due to our large military capability and the superiority of our weapons.
Do you believe that authoritarian regimes will eventually buy whatever they will get from other states if the US stops sending them weapons?
Oh, so I'm sure this is going to be a point of clash in the round. Essentially, I think that other nations replacing us is complex and also will not have the same impact as the United States selling weapons does due to the due to the amount of weapons we produce and their technology.
So imagine if they will be able to send military aid in the capacities of the US. Do you believe that terrorism and rebellion are still going to be factors in those countries, and that we will not see less terrorism or less rebellions in those countries? Would you agree if we consider that they will fund those countries?
Okay, so I have a couple answers to this. So first, the current form of terrorism we see is very anti-US because of our long-term interventionism in the Middle East. If we were not the ones actually giving weapons to their oppressors, we would see terrorism directed much less at the United States. Second answer to this.
But would terrorism still be there in the same amount, but maybe not facing US hatred, but terrorism inside that country?
No, so I don't think so. ISIS and al-Qaeda recruit using the idea of anti-US sentiment. If the US were to withdraw, a common narrative that I've seen in debates so far is that Russia or China will replace us. I'm going to address this in later speeches, but I don't actually believe that you would see the same kind of terroristic impulses directed. And also what I was going to get to earlier is, under my value of deontology, we also shouldn't be complicit. So it doesn't matter if we will be replaced because we will no longer be morally complicit.
So you believe because an action is morally not acceptable, even though the outcome is even less morally acceptable, we should still do that?
So my entire case is that we are very ineffective at guaranteeing any outcomes when it comes to our military aid. Over and over again, we have tried to say, well, the outcomes are worse than this immoral action. However, the problem is we haven't had effective outcomes, and therefore, best way to guarantee good outcomes is through good action.
I'll run some data.
What was the time on the first speech? 600, 600.
Okay, I'd like to stop time.
49 seconds used.
Hello, my name is Maxim, Unruh, and I stand in firm negation of the resolution resolved the United States ought not provide military aid to authoritarian regimes. The negation presents the value stability. Stability creates economic opportunities as well as safety of the people. Key pillar for stability is security. Without the ability to protect one's government, it risks being overtaken by another state or destabilized by terrorist activities. Thus, my value criteria is safety. I want to point out the framing of this debate. The affirmative position relies on evidence suggesting military aid to authoritarian regimes has been unsuccessful. Recognize, however, that the affirmative must prove why it is immoral to deny aid to all authoritarian regimes. On the neck, we don't have to support status quo military aid. There are reasonable policies and conditions the US can implement to make aid more successful. We don't have to defend the worst case examples the DDF provides. Those examples are Saudi Arabia and Egypt, where we don't need to continue with the policies we have right now. Yes. The first point is that withdrawing military aid makes things worse. First of all, I want to show why authoritarian regimes have a strong need for weapons. Authoritarian states have a strong incentive to stay in power and stop security threats from destabilizing their country. If the US withdraws to send military aid to them, they will simply change supplies and get arms elsewhere. States like Russia and China would be more than willing to step in to fill the gap from the US pulling their aid. Russia has already become the world's second largest arms supplier as of 2018, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Furthermore, I want to point out that Russia's economic is in a recession right now and is more than likely to sell more weapons if the US is leaving. The US has a monopoly when it comes to selling weapons, and by withdrawing US military aid, it opens up the opportunity for Russia, which most definitely has the capability. China is also working to influence more countries around the world, especially with the Belt and Road Initiative. They've already promised $100 million in military aid to Cambodia and have expanded their overseas military base in Djibouti. Moreover, the European Union already gives billions of dollars of aid to authoritarian states, including Saudi Arabia. This is important for two reasons. One, let's talk about the best case scenario for the affirmative. It is that nothing would change at all. Authoritarian regimes would get the military supplies from other states, which would give them the economic benefits of selling arms, and we would lose major influence in strategic reasons. Second of all, the worst case scenario, authoritarian regimes like Russia and China would embolden authoritarian regimes and worsen their behavior. Russia and China care far less about human rights abuses than the US. There's no independent media outlets in those two countries that hold the government accountable. Therefore, they would allow more authoritarian behavior if they had influence over other states with military. My opponent's value is morality. Yes, what we are doing is not necessarily completely morally acceptable. But if we stop doing this, we will see much stronger and much violent human rights abuse in that country. And then we need to ask ourselves, is this morally acceptable? Is it morally acceptable to step down and let others do something even worse than we are already doing? Russia and China would furthermore gain more political and economic opportunities in region critical for the US. Such opportunities make Russia and China strong, allowing them to carry out their dangerous military activities. Russia's invasion of Eastern Europe states like Ukraine show they're willing to start dangerous conflicts to get what they want. The same goes for China, who's edging close to conflict by dominating the South China Sea and treating Japan. Yes, we need to ask ourselves, do we want to live in a world where the US is predominantly influencing the world order, or do we want the US to step down from this position and give it over to China and Russia? Now I'm going to talk about my second point. Since authoritarian regimes will get the military aid elsewhere, we would prefer they get the aid from the US for a few reasons. Subpoint A. The US provides more sophisticated and precise weaponry. These weapons are much better than Russia or China, who sell outdated post-World War II and Cold War weapons that are less sophisticated and therefore produce a lot of collateral damage. For example, the Su-25 bomber Russia sells to Syria possesses no targeting system and therefore is more likely to accidentally hit civilian targets. Contrast that with the A-10 fighter jets sold to Saudi Arabia, which have guided missile systems that hit their intended targets. So, if In F's world, eventually those authoritarian regimes will get their weapons from Russia and China, and we will see much more collateral damage and more civilian deaths. This is not morally acceptable. The impact is that when Russia and China sell less sophisticated weapons, they are more likely to hit civilian target hospitals and humanitarian centers on accident. It is morally unacceptable to let victims be killed through US laser precision weapons than dump bombs that bring mass collateral damage and a huge amount of dead civilians. My opponent will probably now bring up the example of Saudi Arabia, where they specifically target hospitals and schools. Well, we don't need to continue how it's going. How I mentioned, we have independent media that is taking our government accountable. It is very likely that the next administration is going to take Saudi Arabia accountable, because the next administration will probably not continue with the process how it's going on. And we will not see that if China and Russia are going to sell those weapons to Saudi Arabia. Subpoint B, the US government is more accountable because of its free press other than China and Russia, which are also foreign regimes that don't care about accountability. An example are the war crimes committed by Assad in Syria, which are funded by Russia. The US expect moderate behavior because human rights play higher value in the US than in China and Russia. If the authoritarian regime is committing war crimes, we can put sanctions in place to stop those from happening furthermore. If we stop sending military aid, authoritarian regimes will still continue to kill people, but with dump bombs instead of laser precision, which result in high unnecessary civilian death. That wouldn't happen otherwise. The US is morally accountable because of those unnecessary deaths wouldn't happen otherwise. We trade our bloody hands into even filthier bloody hands through the proposal of the affirmative is making. Furthermore, by sending military aids to authoritarian regime, it gives us a foothold into that country. We see a lot of progress in authoritarian country and authoritarian regimes that we send military aid to. For example, Saudi Arabia now allows women to drive. We saw the democratization of Greece. We see a stable, sophisticated country in Jordan. Furthermore, the democratization of Kenya and Ghana and Africa. All those examples show that we see a slow progress, but the progress exists. In the affirmative world, we wouldn't see any progress at all, because those authoritarian regimes would get all their supplies from Russia and China, would use no influence to take those authoritarian regimes accountable. Thank you. This is why I stand for NEC.
Okay, actually, let's start telling. So you stated in your burdens that the negative doesn't have to support the status quo. Typically, the negative in LD does support the status quo, but why do you think the United States will change its behavior?
How I briefly mentioned, because we have an independent media outlet in the US that reports about this human rights abuse. You talked a lot about you showed a lot of evidence about human rights abuse in other countries, which is distributing in the US, which people can be informed of, and they can take and we can take democratic decisions in our country, and eventually we can take our own government accountable to take the authoritarian regimes accountable. We will not see this chain in if China and Russia are going to send military aid.
Okay, I hear that. But the problem I have with that is that these articles are available to us. A lot of them are from 2016 or before, and so there is that independent media, there is that information, and yet we haven't seen systematic change from the United States government. Being aware that human rights abuses are happening has been something that the United States citizens have been aware of, and we still haven't really seen change. What do you think will change in the very near future?
Because the whole topic is getting more polarized in our media, furthermore because of the murder of Khashoggi, and because our administration hasn't done anything, it makes a lot of citizens of the US frustrated with the situation and want to the US to act morally good.
Okay. And then, so I'd like to look at this idea of that, we have more sophisticated weapons and that collateral damage to civilians is bad. At the point in which the authoritarian regimes I've referenced in my speech are actively targeting civilian targets, for example, Saudi Arabia is actively targeting hospitals, isn't it better if those weapons are less accurate?
What will eventually happen is that they will use stronger weapons and fly over those hospitals and drop those bombs. Then not only the hospital will be destroyed, but all the blocks and houses surrounding it. and you will in the end see much more civilian death.
Okay.
And if it's the okay.
Thank you. Okay, you also mentioned the idea of China and their Belt and Road Initiative. Why do you, the Belt and Road Initiative is largely an economic plan. Why do you believe
so you want
that
me
it
to
is
bring
not?
up an example what I said, military aid? Well, I talked about Cambodia, but let's talk about Pakistan. After the US withdrew military aid from Pakistan, China immediately signed a treaty with Pakistan to send billions worth of drones to Pakistan. It was the biggest drone deal ever signed by two countries.
Okay. So you also mentioned this idea of like Greece democratized because of our aid. In the aftermath of the Truman Doctrine, we provide Greece with $300 billion of aid, and they joined the EU.
How much is 300 billion?
Yeah, 300 billion.
Do you have any evidence
I
about
do have
300
evidence about
billion?
that. I do have evidence
I
about
want-
that. I can
okay, I
show
wanna
it during the
see.
downtime. So anyways, but they provide with $300 billion with aid versus the average amount of aid we provide is $1 billion. How do you expect that impact
What was
to measure?
inflation counted in? Just as a maybe I'm not allowed. Okay.
US dollars.
Okay. So let's take it like that. And today it's 1 billion. Well, we see that the country is a democracy now, so it turned out good. Isn't that what
Okay.
you're?
I think we're out of
What
time.
you're asking? Yeah, I would like to see the
Okay,
evidence.
I don't really want to use my downtime to show evidence, but if you're willing to listen.
Is it going to run on her downtime, or what is if you check it after the round? Is it not going to be legitimate anymore?
I
You
have
need
it
to
right
use your
here.
you need to use your downtime to look at her evidence unless she's willing to.
Here. Starts right there, and then keep reading the yellow parts highlighted.
And the state rules say you can ask and look at evidence if you're not running downtime. There's just a.
Did you say billions or millions? Did you say billions or millions? Okay, it says millions.
Oh, okay.
So, I want to say that this evidence. Oh, okay, yes. I'll be quiet. Sorry.
Can I start running my downtime?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think it's my downtime. Oh no, it's your downtime. I'm sorry.
So I'm going to start my downtime
Yes.
now. So I'm going to start by going over my opponent's case, address a couple of points of clash that's come up in this round, and hopefully look at our values at the end. So first, this idea of a burden, that the NEG doesn't have to support the status quo. Basically, I'm going to say that on the side of debate, we're looking at the AF world versus the neg world, the world in which we provide military aid versus the one we don't. And so therefore, I think that we need to see the way the United States is currently providing military aid, and while we can acknowledge any compelling reason why we would dramatically change our military aid, we need to keep it grounded in the realism of what we currently see happening. And over again, we don't see the United States changing its policies. We've had independent reporting and the ability for citizens to access information about what's going on in the Middle East and in our wars and interventionism and military aid in the Middle East for years and years, and we haven't really seen meaningful policy change from the United States. We still provide military aid to Saudi Arabia despite outrage over Jamal Khashoggi's death. We are aware of that, but we haven't actually seen any kind of change from in the status quo. And so my opponent can acknowledge the possibility of change, but I'm continuing to arguing that we can't just say we're going to do aid but good now. I don't think that's something we see happening currently. I don't think that's something the United States is likely to drastically change. So with that in mind, I'll move on to his first contention, which is that withdrawal will make it worse. I have a couple answers to this. Like, first, the idea of Russia wanting to provide military aid to authoritarian regimes. The reason Russia currently provides military aid or has military influence within the Middle East is to counter U.S. influence. Essentially, we are playing a game of regional hegemony where both the United States and Russia are trying to gain influence through military aid. The moment the United States leaves the Middle East and stops providing military aid, the most significant pillar in our interventionism in the Middle East, Russia will no longer have an incentive to be so involved. Think about it. Why would Russia want a bunch of heavily armed authoritarian nations in its very backyard that it might one day not control? And so we really see that Russia is unlikely to promote that kind of instability and provide military aid to those regimes. This also follows with historical examples. We have historically provided aid to, say, like the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, whereas Russia provided aid to the government there. Same thing with Syria. The greatest sources of civil war, the greatest sources of instability have been the civil wars and proxy wars caused by both sides trying to gain power. If the United States leaves, Russia has an incentive to create stability, not instability. So moving on to China. So China has their Belt and Road Initiative, which is primarily economic, but I think more importantly, Chinese military aid is human rights neutral. I have evidence from this from Man 2016. And essentially, Chinese aid doesn't have the same kind of human rights abuses that we see occurring when the United States provide aid. I walked you through my case how we see that strengthens authoritarian tendencies and promotes instability, essentially because a lot of Chinese military aid focuses much more heavily on its interactions with economic and humanitarian aid. We aren't actually seeing the kind of influences that the United States is having. So furthermore, I'd like to then go on to a second point, which is U.S. aid is better. Until we see better outcomes, I need to see compelling reasons why the United States aid is actually better. When we talk about progress, that women can drive in Saudi Arabia now, great, but they literally just murdered a dude for being a journalist. Or also with this idea of democratization. Neither democratization nor stability we see terribly tied with the United States aid. Some nations have democratized, like Greece, yes, but other nations like Egypt, we've been giving military aid to for years and years, and we have not seen democracy. And that is the overwhelming case. Democracy is not tied to whether or not we give military aid. Similarly with stability, we provide Egypt and Saudi Arabia and so many other nations, Pakistan, Afghanistan, with military aid for years and years, and stability has not improved because of the anti-American sentiment that is produced when we give aid. What we are truly doing when we provide military aid is creating future Irans. What happened in Iran is we provide military aid to an authoritarian regime for years and years, and the people eventually revolted, established an anti-American government, and now Iran is the regional threat that we face in that region. For these reasons, looking at the long-term system, I believe that the best course of action is the deontological one, and I support the AF. Thank you.
I will run all of my downtime.
Okay.
1 minute remaining. Time.
What my opponent basically is saying, by stopping sending military aid to authoritarian regimes, they wouldn't have the capability of suppressing the people, and you wouldn't see terror groups, and wouldn't see terror groups in those countries anymore. And if this is the case, if the authoritarian regimes will then eventually will have no military aid, they wouldn't have the capabilities of fighting against those terrorist groups, which eventually will well, what my opponent is saying, by stop sending military aid to authoritarian regimes, they will have no military at all. Well, if you think about, well, a lot of authoritarian regimes in the Sahel region or in the Middle East, where a lot of terrorist groups, mainly Al-Qaeda, spread terror around the regions, those authoritarian regimes wouldn't be able to defend themselves against those terror groups, and eventually be unstable and would be unstable and collapse. This is people will die, and so this is an unmoral consequence if we would follow through F's plan. Well, I believe that authoritarian regimes will still continue to get military aid from Russia and China. My opponent brought up that Russia is not going to intervene in the Middle East anymore. Well, if you think back after the Second World War, Russia was the first country who entered the Middle East to gain its oil and to have a harbor in the Indian Ocean. And after that, we started a coalition with Saudi Arabia. So Russia was there first. If we withdraw, Russia would just increase its influence. It's the human nature of greed that thrives Russia forward. That would thrive Russia forward in the Middle East. It would have economical benefits of oil. Russia definitely has the capabilities. It has huge reserves of military after World War II and Cold War, which bring which they would sell to authoritarian regimes. Those weapons bring mass collateral damage, as I pointed out prior. Furthermore, China sold military aid to Pakistan after the US stopped sending military aid to them. It was the biggest drone deal ever conducted between two nations, which now gives Pakistan a huge leverage, which now gives Pakistan huge opportunities. And China has now the leverage over Pakistan, and the US not anymore. Furthermore, my opponent brought up some example where we are not changing anything. For example, Egypt. Well, we are sending military aid to Egypt so we can ensure that Egypt sticks to its peace agreement with Israel. If we stop sending the military aid, they will withdraw out of the peace agreement with Israel. We will see new conflicts in the Middle East between Israel and Egypt. Furthermore, Saudi Arabia. Well, she said, well, women are allowed to drive now, but a man got killed for it. We wouldn't even see the right of women to drive in Saudi Arabia if it wouldn't for the military aid from the US. Because Saudi Arabia would get its military aid from Russia and China and wouldn't care wouldn't care at all about human rights. Furthermore, it would use Russian and China's collateral mass destruction weapons in Yemen and elsewhere. They will still continue to sell those weapons to terrorist groups, which my opponent brought up. They will still continue all the human rights abuses it's doing right now, and it wouldn't have any. It wouldn't be tied to any conditions at all. All the weapons we are selling are tied to following human rights. Yes. It is not always followed, but at least we have something. At least human rights are protected at some point. In the F's world, human rights are not going to be protected at all in authoritarian regimes. We on the next side at least ensure the possibility that human rights are going to be protected in those countries. And we still see a slow progress. I talked about some examples where we had positive influences through military, like Greece, Kenya, Jordan. My opponent said that we sent $300 million to Greece, which is nothing at all compared that we turned this country into a democracy. $300 million, which my evidence of my opponent says. My opponent says that we ensure terroristic activities in those regions, and our military aid brings rebel groups up. Well, I want to mention that terrorist groups always existed everywhere. It is a complicated topic, and just pointing it down to military aid from the US is just naive and not enough of a reason. There are religious reasons behind it and ethnical reasons why terrorist groups exist. Just pinning it out to US military is not enough. And furthermore, if those authoritarian regimes start using mass collateral damage and more civilians will die through it, then we will of course see more and much stronger terrorist groups, because the hatred of the people would be stronger. Why? Because those weapons from US and China would kill more people, which would lead to more uprising. And do I have 1 minute?
No.
Oh, so this is why I believe the NEC is winning this debate and not F. Thank you.
How much time do I have left?
2 minutes and 57 seconds.
Okay, I will use it. Thank you.
One minute remaining.
the idea of consequentialism and my opponent's value of stability. I'd like to look at the main points of clash in this round under that framework and really analyze them. So first, this idea of stability in the context of Russia and China. So one, this idea of Russia was there first, and because of human nature and greed, Russia will still pursue oil. I would much rather the United States and Russia pursue a battle over who can access oil and that has no impact on the stability of the region, right? So like if we're both trying to get oil through non-military means, it doesn't actually link to this idea of stability. Furthermore, again, I would like to bring you this analysis of like the entire reason Russia provides military weapons to authoritarian regimes in its backyard. Something that is objectively kind of dangerous for Russia to be doing is only because it's in this pseudo-proxy war with the United States. If we are no longer providing weapons and military aid to authoritarian regimes in that area, Russia will no longer feel that need, because the only reason it does that is to balance against our power. So then again, in the context of terrorism, at the point at which Al-Qaeda and Iran and ISIS use anti-American sentiment to fuel their terrorism, to fuel their recruitment, American interventionism is contributing to that. I brought you the example of Iran. All of the actions we are taking today in Yemen, in Egypt, creating future Irans, future anti-American nations who are going to undermine the stability of the region. So last, this idea of democratization and stability both at the same time. We need to really divorce the idea that military aid can create either democratization or stability. I brought you in my second contention this idea that it strengthens authoritarian tendencies and it promotes instability. At the point where we see nations reselling the weapons to terrorists, at the point where we see that nations can rise and fall without our authoritarian aid, that they can become democratic or they can remain authoritarian nations with or without our aid, we no longer can say that aid is creating that outcome. So at the very least, if you believe all of the consequentialism of this debate is a wash, which I think that it still does fall to the upside and we still do produce better outcomes, we still need to look at the deontology, which is really my value that's gone uncontested throughout this round. This idea of I am the only side or the act's the only side that can solve for the inherent moral complicitness of our actions in Saudi Arabia and Yemen. When we are uncertain about what the ends are, we can never use the ends to justify the means. Therefore, we cannot say that we are producing better outcomes if we never, in fact, produce these better outcomes, whether for United States citizens or citizens of the world. For this reason, I believe that Russia and China stuff matters less, because at least we are not morally complicit in the deaths and the human rights abuses occurring within these nations. I brought to you the acute harms to political dissidents, to women, to the LGBTQ+ community. Every day we provide military aid to authoritarian regimes, we are directly funding, contributing, and endorsing those human rights abuses, and that, I think, is the thing that should matter the most in this debate. I believe that the AF wins on both the consequences and the inherent moral value. For these reasons, I am proud to stand on AF. Thank you.